So this is a video on the respiratory system. So the respiratory system is all about the delivery uh, of oxygen from the outside into the tissues to be used in uh, oxidative phosphorylation and in cellular respiration, making ATP, and about getting rid of volatile waste products, most notably carbon dioxide. However, it can be things like alcohol and other, uh, you know, some of the ketones that are involved in garlic and things, all can be gotten rid of out of the body by the respiratory system. Now, respiration itself and this process involves two systems. It's the respiratory system and the circulatory system. Uh, and it really consists of four processes uh, that are shared between those two systems. So we look at the overlap uh, is at external respiration. But the first thing we have to do is we have to get air in and out of our face. Like we have to be able to ventilate, it's called. So we move air in and out of our lungs. Now remember, the lumen of the entire respiratory system is outside the body. So all we're doing is we're moving air from outside of our face into our respiratory system, into the lumen of the respiratory system, which is still outside the body. Um, and that's called ventilation, pulmonary ventilation, breathing. Then we have to get the gases that we want from that air into our body, so that's oxygen. And then we have to get the carbon dioxide and waste products out of our body and into that air. So the exchange that happens at the lungs between the circulatory system and the respiratory system is called external respiration. Then the circulatory system transports oxygen and carbon dioxide in the blood to get it to the tissues, and then the oxygen has to leave the bloodstream and go into the tissues, and leaves the tissue. Leaving the tissues is the carbon dioxide and other waste products to go back to the blood, and that's called internal respiration. So we talked a bit of that when we talked about capillary exchange and in the circulatory system. So this is kind of the next step. So when we look at the organs that are going to facilitate this this ventilation, pulmonary ventilation, and the external respiration, there's various organs. There's the nose and associated structures, the pharynx, which the nasopharynx is part of, is just respiratory. The oropharynx and the laryngopharynx is part of the digestive system as well. So this tube actually does both food and air. The larynx, which is the switching station, this is the place where we send food down one pathway and air down a different pathway. It's the larynx. The trachea is the pipe that leads from the larynx down to the lungs. The bronchi and the bronchioles, all the branches of the bronchi, are the tubes that carry air out to the lungs and distribute it through the lungs. And then the lungs are made up of this tissue, the specialized tissue called alveoli. And it's at the alveoli that we get gas exchange happening. This is where external respiration happens. So, again, this shouldn't be a big surprise, but we have the nose and its bits, the pharynx, the larynx, trachea, bronchi, lungs / alveoli. Now, part of this, from here down to in the lungs, is something called the conducting zone. And all it is a network of pipes. It's just plumbing that gets air down to the place where respiration can happen. The place where the gas exchange happens is called the respiratory zone. This is the site of the gas exchange. So external respiration only happens in the respiratory zone. However, ventilation has to happen through the respiratory zone and the conducting zone. So this has some profound implications later, because a lot of people can move air, but it's getting enough air to the respiratory zone that matters, because that's the only place the gas exchange can happen. When you go snorkeling and you're breathing through a snorkel, the conducting zone gets a little bit longer. Really, the trachea is no different than a snorkel. It's just a pipe that allows air to pass. And then there's the respiratory muscles. There's the muscles that we use to promote ventilation, and that primarily is the diaphragm. But there's intercostal muscles and various other muscles that are involved with breathing, with ventilating. So we'll start with the nose, because that's where the air enters. So it's a passageway for respiration, but it's not a passive passageway. It's got some functions. One of the functions is that it moistens the air. If air is too dry, then gas exchange doesn't work very well. The gas is exchanged in dissolved form, so it's got to be dissolved in liquid. So to get external respiration, it needs to have the right amount of moisture. We also don't want dirt in that air that's going to clog up the respiratory zone. So we want to get the dirt out of there. And so the nose is a big part of filtering and cleaning the air. So it becomes moist and warm and clean passing through the nose. The nose obviously is where the olfactory senses happen, so the sense of smell happens in the nose. And then, as anybody who's ever had a head cold knows, that the nose and its associated structures are the resonating chamber for speech. If you block your nose, you end up talking like this, because it doesn't resonate properly. So there's two bits to the nose. There's the nose that we think of when we think of the nose, and that's the external nose. So that's the root of the nose, the bridge, the dorsum nasi, so that's the kind of the ridge along the nose below where the glasses sit, and the apex, which is the tip of your nose. There's two little grooves, or there's two little ridges and a groove that go from your nose down to your upper lip, and that's called the philtrum. And the whole point of the philtrum is to prevent a baby that's suckling from having their lips actually cover their nose, because they breathe through their nose while they're on the nipple. And it's very hard to actually block your nostrils with your upper lip because of this arrangement called the philtrum. The nostrils are the openings. It's sometimes called NURS. And on either side of the nostril are the wings of the nostril, or the alae. So this is the bit, right? With the alae being over here. Internally, part of the external nose, or like beneath the skin, part of the external nose is made of bone. It's mostly the nasal bone and the frontal process of the maxillary bone. I guess a bit of the frontal bone comes down right here. That's frontal bone. Um, the zygomatic bone doesn't make it that far over. This is all maxilla here. Then this is hyaline cartilage. These cartilages give the shape of the nose. And then the ala of the nose is not cartilage. It is actually dense, irregular connective tissue. Um, it's that's why you get the piercing over here and not here generally, because if it comes here on the cartilage, there's a chance that you can crack the hyaline cartilage, whereas here on the dense, irregular connective tissue, you really don't have much of a chance to have that happen. So there, behind this external nose is the nasal cavity. So it is divided into two sides because there's a septum, a wall in between, and it opens up into the nasopharynx. So we call just the posterior apertures is generally what most people call them. The roof of the nose is made of the ethmoid bone and a little bit of the sphenoid bones. The floor of the nose is actually the roof of the mouth, so it's the hard and soft palate. The bit of the nose where anybody that's picking their nose, where the nose hairs are, is called the vestibule. It's about filtering the air. The superior part is the where the olfactory nerve is, so that's called the olfactory mucosa, and that's on the superior side, right below the ethmoid bone. Right. The rest of the nose, the interior, the mucosa of the nose, is made of a pseudostratified columnar epithelium, and it's ciliated. We actually saw this last year in the lab. One of the slides that I had you identify was actually respiratory mucosa from the inside of the nose. It was you labeled it as a pseudostratified ciliated epithelium. Now, in that pseudostratified epithelium, there are goblet cells that make mucus. And the mucus that's made is not a benign sort of thing. In it, there are defensins and lysozymes and things that will kill any microorganism that get trapped in that mucus, reed, snot. Now, the cilia are constantly sweeping this mucus posteriorly towards your throat. You end up swallowing about 1.5 liters or 2 liters of this mucus a day. It's too expensive to the body in terms of water and protein to waste it. The only time that it doesn't go that way is when either cold weather or inflammation causes the cilia to stop moving, and then gravity has that mucus run forward, and that's why your nose runs. Now, in behind this respiratory mucosa, there's a huge network of blood vessels, capillaries, veins, and they're there to provide the moisture and the heat to moisten and heat the air. There's also a lot of sensory nerves that are there that if they get irritated, they cause you to sneeze. And again, it's to prevent you from inhaling things that get right down into the alveoli. It's a protective mechanism. It ends up looking like this. So this mucosa here is the one that we're talking about. Now, you'll notice that in this picture, there seem to be 3 passages here. They're called the meatus. There is the inferior, the middle, and the superior nasal meatus, one on either side. So there's 6 passages total, and the conchae are here, and we'll get to what they do in just a moment. But air has to pass up, and there's lots of surface area here to moisten and heat the air. Very, very highly vascular, which is why people get nosebleeds. The hairs are all here in the vestibule, right? And they get coated in mucus and they become sticky and help filter the air. So these conchae, which if it sounds like the word conch, which is a seashell, it's on purpose. I showed this to you when we were looking at the bones of the skull. They are they're the walls of the ethmoid bone and the turbinate bones. And what they do is they act like a Dyson vacuum cleaner. They cause the air that's passing through those meatus to spin. And when it spins, centrifugal force throws the dust into the snot, and so they help clean it. The spinning air also puts more air, and the turbulence causes more air to come in contact with the mucosa, which again moistens and heats the air. Plus, they just create more surface area. So the other thing that's interesting, and most people don't think about it, is that when we're breathing out, the air that we breathe out is warm. And if we breathe out through our nose, we end up, because of the surface area, heating the conchae. And so we end up reclaiming the heat. We don't lose heat to the outside air near as much because of these structures. In behind the nose, there are various sinuses. These lighten the skull. They hold warm air. They hold moisture. Anybody that's ever had any sinus problems knows exactly where they are. But there's one in the frontal bone. There's one in the sphenoid bone. There's ethmoid bone, and they're in the maxillary bone. So there's and they're all around the nose and the nasal cavity, and they drain into the nasal cavity, so we call them the paranasal sinuses. And they're a big part of what causes the resonance of the voice. Now, the pharynx is the next part. The pharynx is a muscular tube. It's soft-walled, and it goes from behind the nose, from the posterior apertures, and goes down towards your throat. Now, it's divided into a couple of parts. There's the part behind the nose, the nasopharynx. There's the part behind the mouth, the oropharynx. And there's the part that attaches to the larynx, the laryngopharynx. So it runs that whole area behind the nose, from right at the base of the skull, so right from the ethmoid bone all the way down. And these are the 3 regions. Now, the 3 regions vary. In the nasopharynx, the mucosa is a pseudostratified ciliated mucosa. It's just the same as the respiratory mucosa. In the oropharynx and the laryngopharynx, because it's also a passageway for food, this is a non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. No cilia and no mucus. So if we go back to here, you can see that this part of the soft palate that hangs down is called the uvula. When you swallow, the uvula pushes up and blocks the nasopharynx, makes the food go south. and so that's called the uvula. There are tonsils at the nasopharynx called the adenoids, the pharyngeal tonsils, and there are tubes that open up into behind the ear. So they equalize the pressure on either side of the eardrum. And anybody that's ever had these auditory tubes blocked will know what happens when the pressure on both sides is not the same. You want it to be always the same. So that tube is right here. It used to be called the eustachian tube, and oftentimes it's still referred to as the eustachian tube. And there's two little tonsils around the tube called the tubal tonsils, and they help protect that. Sometimes when the tubal tonsils get inflamed, they block that, and the eustachian tube can't equalize the air. Oftentimes in little kids, the lumen of that tube is too small and mucus gets in there and that blocks. And so then to make the pressure equal on both sides of the eardrum, they put a little hole in the eardrum and put a little connecting tube through because it helps drain and equalize the pressure on both sides. The oropharynx, like I say, is stratified squamous epithelium. We'll talk about the opening to the oral cavity when we talk digestive system. This is where the palatine tonsils are and the lingual tonsil. So the palatine tonsils are the ones you get tonsillitis in. The lingual tonsil is attached to the tongue. The laryngopharynx is really just above the epiglottis, which is part of the larynx. So it is continuous with both the esophagus and the larynx. So it's down here. So this is considered the laryngopharynx. To here, beyond here, it's called the esophagus, and this way, this opening is into the trachea. This is the epiglottis here, and the epiglottis is basically the routing mechanism that sends food down the esophagus and air down the trachea at the appropriate times. We'll review this again in digestive system, but you'll notice that the hyoid bone here is attached to the epiglottis, and the hyoid bone is also attached to the tongue. When you push the tongue up, it lifts the hyoid, which pulls this side of the epiglottis this way, which makes it cover like a garbage can lid down over the glottis, as it were, the opening of the trachea. When you're not swallowing, it's up. When the tongue's down, it's open. Air can pass easily this way.